Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin plenary session 4. All speakers are given 7 to 8 minutes for the presentation, and we cordially ask you to keep the time, especially because of the closing ceremony that's going to follow after this session at 5:30. Now, if you could look at the screen, you can see that you can share your questions and opinions in real time during the conference. For Twitter users, please tweet using the following hashtag, which is #SeoulCyber_P4. Standing Commissioner Kim Dae-hee of the Korea Communications Commission will serve as moderator for this session. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Standing Commissioner Kim.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome to plenary session 4, the final wrap-up session. I am Kim Dae-hee, Commissioner of Korea Communications Commission, which is in charge of media and the telecommunications regulatory policies in Korea. A couple of months ago, I got a phone call from the committee that are preparing this meeting, and then he said that I needed to be at this plenary session as a moderator, and he added that there needed to be someone that as a high-level officer. So I thought, what the high-level officer is, and then I don't know about high-level officer. One thing is that it's almost time you get retired. So anyway, I got the role because somebody has to take the role, and I have a secret to tell you. I didn't know that this hall is such a big hall like this. Make me nervous. If I had knew, I wouldn't take this role. But anyway, I'll try to do my best. And we have many distinguished guests here. I know that they are very experts and have many excellent experiences in their respective fields. So I don't worry about my moderating this session. So I'll give them as much time as possible, and I'll talk very small. So now let me introduce the distinguished panelists here. First of all, His Excellency Ed Vaizey, Minister for Culture, Communications, Creative Industries of the United Kingdom. He moderated at Panel 1 in Economic Development and Growth. And next to him is Ms. next to him is Olof Ehrenkrona, Ambassador and Senior Advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sweden. And next to him is Ms. Jane Hall-Ruth, President and CEO of the Council on Cybersecurity, and she is former Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security of the United States. She moderated at Panel 2, Cybersecurity. And then next to him, Mr. James Andrew Lewis, Senior Fellow of the CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He moderated at Panel 5, International Security. And then next to him is Mr. François Guimond, Deputy Minister of Public Safety of Canada, and he is from Panel 4, Cybercrime. And then Ms. Lee Hyun-suk, Director of the UN Asia Pacific Training Center for ICT Development. She moderated at Panel 6, Capacity Building. So I'll ask you to welcome them with a big hand. So we're going to start our presentations, starting from His Excellency Ed Vaizey.
Thank you very much, and may I begin by saying how much I've enjoyed the conference. It's been brilliantly organized by the Korean government, and I think a lot of important issues have been raised. So thank you very much for everything that's happened over the last 2 days. I kicked off the first panel session, which was about economic growth and development, and whatever the other moderators say, my panel session was the best. and it was certainly the most brilliantly moderated. But I just want to get that in early. I'm a politician, very competitive. Economic growth and development. We talked obviously about the Internet's contribution to economic growth, but obviously we wanted to get underneath that statement and look at the issues and causes of why the Internet has been so integral to global growth. We had an extraordinarily talented and insightful panel. We had the Vice Minister for Science, ICT and Future Planning from the Korean government, Mr. Yoon. We had Bosun Tijani, a Nigerian entrepreneur, the founder of the Co-Creation Hub. We had Lee Sergo, who is the Chief Executive of the Kakao Corporation in Korea, which is an instant messaging site which exchanges 5.2 billion messages every single day. We had Jørgen Abild Andersen from Denmark, but also the chairman of the ICCP Committee on the OECD, and one of the world's most experienced telecoms regulators. From Brazil, we had the Secretary of the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, Virgilio Almeida, and we had Izuka Hisao from Japan, as well as Dongwook Kim, the president of the Korea Information Society Development Institute. So a very wide spread of people from both Korea, but also developed and developing economies. The panel representing as well government, entrepreneurs, and international organizations. What was interesting, of course, was that among a diverse group, very strong and common themes emerged. As I said at the beginning, the Internet can be a driver for growth, but all the speakers were keen to emphasize the need for the Internet to maintain its open and dynamic model, supported, of course, by regulation, but by light-touch public policy frameworks, not heavy-handed top-down regulation. And whilst the public policies explored by the panel differed slightly, depending on local conditions, these were the common elements, I think, emerged. First of all, it's very important to encourage access to infrastructure, to equipment and technology, and to keep costs down. It's important to have a strong education program, particularly for young people, to support growth. It's important to invest in research and development. It's important to create an entrepreneurial environment that supports the new business models emerging on the Internet. It's important to support that with flexible tax and legislation that supports this investment and supports, very importantly, supports innovation. And above all, to ensure a multi-stakeholder model which will create demand, but also to help develop solutions. It was a very important point made both by the speakers and people who made points from the audience, that government alone does not hold all the answers, and that a multi-stakeholder model allows business and civic society to input with its own ideas as well. Here are some of the detailed points that we made. It was very telling for me to learn that here in Korea alone, the Korean economy, 12% of the Korean economy is the IT economy, and it provides more than a quarter of Korean exports. And this is because the Korean government has taken a dynamic approach. It's encouraged the development of this sector by focusing on promoting software skills, particularly in young people. It's introducing new software education program in primary schools this year, and it's creating the right taxation regimes and the right legislative framework. And the Kakao Corporation showed us this incredible success, a company created in 2007, and as I said earlier, now very dominant and powerful. The experience in Nigeria also showed that economic growth based on the Internet is based on good governance, and that was enhanced by empowering individuals and non-state actors to contribute to the application of technology. And Bosun Tijani was clear that the goal of his organization, the Co-Creation Hub, was to harness the skills of civic society, not simply to look to government for solutions for every problem. He gave an example, Budget, a project which makes budget and financial data from government more comprehensible to citizens, but that's now being used by government itself, or IHQ, an industry-led project to leverage the innovation assets within the Nigerian tech cluster and to create an innovative city. Mr. Anderson set out the strong case for the economic benefits of the internet. 2011 McKinsey report that he cited showed that the internet accounted for as much growth in the last 5 years as the Industrial Revolution had done in 50 years. It created more than 2.5 jobs for every job that was displaced by the digital economy. And the app economy alone, which was really only created in the last 4 years, is already worth $20 billion in the US. Mr. Anderson showed that the OECD has collected the best of the best public policies around the world, and it has developed 14 principles for internet-related public policies. Principles such as multi-stakeholderism, openness, taxation, as well as the protection of rights of privacy and of intellectual property. Professor Almeida from Brazil said that the Brazilian model for internet governance had helped to develop strong public policies which were focused on increasing the use of cyberspace to Brazil through the establishment of the Internet Steering Committee. And this committee, again, follows a multi-stakeholder model. It's almost 20 years old. It includes 21 members, and importantly, the minority are from government. Only 9 members are from government. And this group seeks to increase the transparency of decision-making through measures such as establishing regional intergovernmental forums which feed views into the steering committee. The Brazilian government, we learned, was also considering legislation to create a civil rights framework, and this is going to have 5 principles. They are going to be net neutrality, the right to privacy, the protection of rights such as freedom of expression, and a new element of data protection, which will seek to keep data generated within Brazil subject to Brazilian laws. And Mr. Izuka pointed out, from Japan, pointed out that the use of, as the use of ICT increased, so did cyber threats. Mr. Izuka was keen to focus particularly on the security aspect of the internet. Obviously, the more we use it, the more the threats can potentially arise, such as theft or unauthorized access or loss of information. So it was incredibly important to remember that collaboration between government and private sector bodies was the best way to combat this. And I think ending on the note of cyber security would be a good segue to Ms. Hull's comments later on. But I think another point that emerged from the discussion with the audience was about the digital divide, the importance of developed nations supporting developing nations in the use of ICT, and also focusing on the digital divide, not just between nations, but also within nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister Vaisi. Yeah, that discussion was very comprehensive.
Did I keep the time?
Oh, yes. Thank you for keeping the time. Yeah. Very comprehensive, including all the expressing the cyberspace as a major driver of the economic development. And that was very informative, and maybe we can develop this discussion further. And next, we have a presentation from Ambassador Eren Krona about social and cultural benefits from cyberspace.
Thank you. I had a very multi-stakeholder panel. We were one diplomat, one civil servant, one entrepreneur, and one, should I say, telecom administrator. And as a crown or jewel in the crown, I would say, we had a poet as well, and a writer. We started to discuss the phenomenon that is, I would say, is maybe I should phrase it as an expansion on the role of the issue of access, from access through infrastructure to the access to content. The more the infrastructure is in place all over the world, the more important it will be to actually deal with these issues of access to content and access to, or what could be called internet literacy, in order for people to be able to utilize the opportunities of the internet. We discussed this, discussed expansions, fast expansion of education online, and we also had the opportunity to reflect on the problems with the preservation of our digital heritage when software and hardware is changing so fast as they have been doing. Then we got a most interesting presentation on what is going on the African continent, with regard both to investment in the necessary infrastructure, which is still important, investments in the institutional capacity, as well as what is done to build capacity among the end users. We also got some concrete examples of best practices and policies for institutional capacity building. Our distinguished representative from Korea presented Korea's most ambitious and successful, I would say, world-class project on e-government. And citizens' participation through e-government and what is done in order to open up government for greater transparency. We got a very clear picture from that intervention on the link between the necessary capacity with regard to infrastructure and the opportunities to increase efficiency and transparency in public administration. So that is a dimension of the capacity that is more seldom discussed, but it is obviously of big interest. It was a panel with a very positive approach. We discussed opportunities much more than the problems, but one of the panelists took on the task actually to problematize the use of social media in perspective of how to protect privacy, the risks with storing big data, much data, personal data in social media, and the increasing complexity with the use of big data in this context was of course also mentioned. Sorry to say we did not have time enough to dig deeper into this problem, but I would say this is a thing that will raise on the agenda. Another distinguished panelist made a most interesting contribution on the need to preserve the grassroots character of the internet. How can we do this in an internet where more or less everyone is online? And the moderator, if I may humble enough to quote myself, added that is it possible to preserve the grassroots identity when we have the Internet of Things with 7 times many devices on the net that there are humans online? The panelists gave nevertheless a strong case for the importance of grassroots involvement, even in the issues like combating cybercrime and strength and security. Last but not least, we took note of our civil society representatives' request for a stronger civil society participation in meetings like this. I would say that if you broaden the definition slightly, and in the definition also include academia and non-governmental individual representatives, the civil society representation here has been quite numerous. On the other hand, one should also be aware of the fact that one needs a critical mass of NGOs. It's really crucial to have that if you want to reflect the multi-stakeholder character of cyberspace. And the point is for sure taken. I'm quite sure that civil society will most certainly be given an important role in the upcoming events. During the Q&A part of the session, we discussed the role of NGOs and how to build social capital in cyberspace. And this is also, of course, a most interesting and important issue if you really want to dwell on the social and cultural benefits of ICT. Whatever you do, in online education or social media or address books or emailing, you are a part of building the social capital. It's your own social capital, but of course it's also some sort of a collective good. And you can count it on it mathematically, but of course if you look at how, when you increase the number of participants in a network, the consequences of this increasing numbers grows exponentially. And it's a total different world if we had 500 million internet users compared to a world where you have all 7 billion people online. And everyone else in the world is not far away from us than 6 to 8 clicks on the keyboard. Of course, this is a very, very different story from how it used to be in the early 90s. And there are risks with that, but primarily there are enormous opportunities, and you build a social capital which will be of great importance. I will stop there and say that, repeat what I said, it was a very, very positive tone in the panel, and we really looked into the opportunities, both from a social perspective, from a democracy perspective and participatory perspective, and also for building social capital and building on the human capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Corona. Your summary gave us valuable implications. I was also in your session, and you described the summary very in detail, and thank you for that. And next, I'd like to ask Dr. Jane Lewis to speak about cybersecurity.
Well, thanks very much. If Edward's panel had the best moderator, my panel had the best panelists. Whenever you go to a meeting, whenever I go to a meeting, one of the small disciplines that I have is to ask myself, you know, at the end of this meeting, whether it's 2 hours or 2 days, we want to know something more than we knew when we started. We want to understand something better than when we started, or we want to do something as a result of what we now know and understand. And certainly from my own perspective, and I think the perspective of my panelists, this conference, very ably put on by the government of the Republic of Korea, has met all of those criteria. So again, we applaud the organizers for their commitment to this issue and sustaining a dialogue over time, which is not always easy in the international community. The panelists on the panel that was called Cybersecurity were Neil Kloppenstein, the Executive Director of the OAS, the Executive Secretary of the OAS, Yuri Ito, who was Chair of AP CERT and the Director of Japan CERT, Sherry Maguire, the Vice President for Global and Government Affairs for Symantec, John Suffolk, the Senior Vice President for Huawei, Ki-Ju Lee, who is the President of KISA, and Laszlo Deák, who is the International Outreach for Cyber from Hungary. Our main job was to talk about cybersecurity, not really to define it, but to talk about it and talk about the kind of progress that we've seen. We were asked to look at major threats and trends, see whether or not there was any improvement in border cooperation. We were also asked to engage all of the stakeholders and prioritize cybersecurity at all levels, domestically and internationally, and importantly, to discuss practical ways to prevent cyber intrusions and protect us all better. Quite thankfully, from my own personal perspective, we spent almost no time on threats. And it's an extraordinary cybersecurity discussion that you can have where everyone doesn't spend a good deal of time sort of in a trying to impress each other with just how dire the circumstances have become, or how bad the bad guys have gotten, or how clever adversaries are, or the enumerating ways in which we are vulnerable in cyberspace. It's taken as a given that we are vulnerable in cyberspace. And as we become ever more connected online, and ever more of our lives depend on a well-functioning internet and reliable access to cyberspace, there is no question that uniformly we are vulnerable. But the panel did not spend any time on that. Instead, and we had a multi-stakeholder representation as well. We talked about evolution of cybersecurity at the national level, evolution at the international level with an emphasis on regional evolution, and evolution in the developing world, very briefly, through the pre-workshop on Africa and our colleague from Hungary who spoke about that briefly, and evolution in the private sector. At the national level, I think things have dramatically changed over the past 5 years alone. Colleagues spoke about greater awareness, the stand-up of more certs for the collation, identification, and response to cyber incidents, the increase in training, but equally, they talked about the increased requirements for information and for information sharing, greater requirements for training and familiarity and practical hands-on experience for responding to cyber incidents. And they spoke uniformly about the requirement for international cooperation. Again and again, a common theme was that there are no silver bullets for protecting us in cyberspace. No single agency, no single government, no single region of governments can do all that needs doing to protect us in cyberspace. At the international level, the regional progress was really notable, both here in the Pacific and in the area of responsibility under the OAS, where we talked about at some length. Again, there has been enormous progress in raising awareness, in governments collaborating, increasingly developing their own CERT capability, and reaching out to share information, but equally, not only with each other, government to government, but also government to private sector as well. In the private sector, our colleague from Symantec really emphasized the importance, the essential element of collaboration that's required. None of the work that anyone does can be done in a vacuum. The problems that we're facing, the vulnerabilities that we have are complex. They're constantly evolving. I think two things are true and noteworthy. One of the noteworthy things that's true, 25 years after sort of a famous case, at least in the United States, was documented about a cyber intrusion in the book called The Cuckoo's Nest. 25 years later, there's absolutely nothing you can do online. You can't get online, stop, shop, connect, talk, visit, browse. There's nothing you can do confident that your identity and your information will not be compromised. And this is 25 years into this field. That's number one. The second thing that's also true is that the problems and the solutions to those problems that we will be dealing with even 2 years from now have not been invented yet. So at some level, it's hard to overstate the complexity and the constant evolution in cyberspace, but no government is standing still, no region is standing still, industry is not standing still either. And in fact, it was quite interesting as we were talking about the developing world, the digital divide, which did come up as relevant to cybersecurity. Our colleague from Hungary made two, I think, very important points. One, not all technical problems require technical solutions. And number two, when we're talking about things like access to the internet, yes, we are talking about technology and the availability and reliability of technology, often in remote and difficult and austere environments. And we're talking about affordability of not only the technology, but of the training and the sustainment necessary to keep people online. One of our youth colleagues today talked about the importance of the human factor in the education and awareness and the ability to fully take advantage of the internet. But Laszlo Deák talked about technology, affordability, and the presence and availability of local language content as well as an important factor. What were our major messages? First, the message of constant evolution that I talked about. Every level is evolving. Secondly, collaboration is essential. And in this regard, there has been an improvement in the global environment, but the importance of sharing cannot be overstated, and the importance of metrics to raise the robustness of search statistics and knowledge everywhere across the board on cybersecurity is essential. There are no silver bullets, no single actor, no single layer can solve all the problems here. We do need to accumulate and share the data that will allow us to benchmark where we are and measure progress. How do we know we're getting more secure online? And particularly for those of us who are not technologists, this is a key set of questions that has to be answered. Not far away from this, some of our industry colleagues spoke about the importance of government setting clear standards so that industry would know what targets to hit. And then finally, I think what we all recognize is that while what governments are doing individually, bilaterally, in a multilateral setting is important, clearly the rest of us need clear, plain language messages of the important steps that we need to take to protect our data. And here I emphasized, and my colleagues seem to agree, the importance of the critical controls as prioritized first steps that each of us can take. As the Australians have recently proven, and my colleague to my left, Jim Lewis, has written about in a compelling way, 4 measures will reduce our vulnerability by 80% or more. 4 simple things that are absolutely low or no cost, and you probably have them in your systems, although very likely not switched on at the moment. So this combination of new knowledge, what are people doing? What are countries doing? What's industry doing? Where is it going? A new understanding that cybersecurity is no longer this vaguely understood word. It may still be vaguely understood, but it's increasing, there are increasing awareness and comprehension at all layers of life. And then from a very practical matter, what we should do. Institute the 4 critical controls, share information, establish metrics, practical means that will improve cybersecurity for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Luth. And next is Mr. James Andrew Lewis, sorry, for his summary about international security discussion. So
Great.
Cybersecurity and international cybersecurity.
Thank you. In some ways, mine was perhaps the politest panel, which is not what you would expect when you have Russia, China, and the US on, but they were all very respectful of each other, and so I appreciated that. As you've probably heard in many of the presentations, the UN report of the group of government experts on international security in the use of information technology issued this June, or agreed this June in 2003, has been a path-breaking moment, a moment that's reshaped the politics of the internet. That hasn't percolated through to all audiences yet, and so you'll see a slow dawning that the things that were in the GGE report, the endorsement of the UN Charter, the applicability of international law, the applicability of state sovereignty, and the various commitments that come with it, as that percolates out through the communities that think about the internet, you're going to see political change. And that was something that everyone in the group seemed to agree on, right? So this was important. The next thing they talked about was the development of norms and confidence building measures. A little bit of a dispute there. I tend to feel that we haven't perhaps moved as quickly as we could have in this area. Other people seem to think that given the level of distrust that exists among nations, we've actually done quite well. Example held up was, of course, the Russian-US bilateral, perhaps that's why they were so polite to each other. But the fact that Russia and the US could reach an agreement on confidence-building measures for cybersecurity is taken as, again, another precedent. So it's been a year of developments in international security that has in many ways reshaped the landscape. One issue that came up briefly but wasn't really talked about was the reshaping effect of the Snowden leaks. People acknowledged it, said it's changed the political dynamics, but it hasn't really changed the larger trends that we're seeing in cybersecurity. An interesting discussion of the multi-stakeholder model. I was a bit surprised, and this was perhaps the surprising thing on the panel, in that there was general consensus that the multi-stakeholder approach was essential. That's great. And it was, people practically fell out of their chairs when our Russian colleagues said that. However, it turns out that when you say, okay, that's great, well, what's a multi-stakeholder? That there are very different definitions among people. And so one of the areas for future work is, what does multi-stakeholder mean? Where there is consensus is it does not mean what we have now, right? That the current approaches that involve multi-stakeholder models are no longer sufficient. And there will be debate, this is incipient in our panel, between different countries on how you reform the multi-stakeholder model. What we have now will change. What it will change to, we don't really know, right? There was less consensus. Well, there was general consensus that the multi-stakeholder model was essential in some way, albeit in a new form. There was less consensus on militarization. And I'd say the split here is countries that like to pretend that there aren't military activities in cyberspace, and countries that admit their military activities and say we need to incorporate them into the framework of international law, the existing treaties that govern armed conflict. That's going to be a hard one, and I think everyone says confidence building measures and transparency are good. It's going to be very difficult to get transparency and confidence building measures if people don't admit to what they're actually doing. And this was readily apparent on the panel, readily apparent on some other areas. So, you know, this will be a future topic for debate. It's very much something in the sphere of government activities. There's not a lot of contributions on militarization and military activity that the private sector can make. I'm reminded of a famous Russian who once asked, how many divisions has the Pope? You could say the same thing about companies. So this will be a topic for dispute, and I think it will affect the larger pace of discussion on international security. One of the things that troubled people in the audience was we talked at the end about the convergence between internet governance and cybersecurity. And generally there was a consensus on the panel that governance needs to change in order for the internet to become more secure. And this relates back to the discussion of what is a multi-stakeholder. You know, what does the multi-stakeholder model need to look like? But whereas, say, 5 years ago, you had a community that talked about cybersecurity and a community that talked about internet governance, and they rarely ever interacted, we are now seeing these things drawn together, albeit with some resistance, right? Albeit with some unhappiness, particularly in the internet community. But governance and cybersecurity will be the same issue sometime in the next year. And we're already seeing that. It was one of the underlying themes of the group of government expert reports. Debate over how best to approach this. Do you use the existing institutions, if you can call them that? Do you use the existing model? Where there was not consensus was on what sort of institutional framework you need for progress in international security. I would say that the majority of countries believe that the United Nations needs to play a larger role. There's a significant minority that believes that the UN is not the best place, that we need to look at regional alternatives to it. But not an area where there's consensus. Clearly the UN will do something. The issue then became, what does the UN do? There will likely be another group of government experts, a fourth meeting in 2014, if the UN can work out all the administrative details. That's a good thing, and everyone agreed that where you want to talk about norms and confidence building measures is in the UN in another group of governmental experts. But some people went beyond this and said, no, you need new institutions that think about cybersecurity. Some held up the ITU. That's, of course, generated a strong reaction from others. Some said we need something like the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, an IAEA for cybersecurity. Difficult to see how that would work, but it's an idea that reflects a desire for some kind of new institutional framework to think about this. So what struck me on this panel was there are areas of consensus that we wouldn't have expected, say, a year or two ago. But when you dig deeper, the consensus is very shallow. There are still strong disputes. And the work agenda in international security for the next year will be to look at these areas of dispute. Now, I will say one thing, which is that a lot of times at sessions like this, you hear a lot of things. And what I would caution you is a collection of opinions is not data, right? And so we've heard many assertions here, a range of assertions. The Westphalian state is over, just whatever you want. And what we need to ask ourselves is, how do we test these assertions? How do we test these opinions? Because many of them don't actually make sense. And one of the benefits of conferences like this is we can have a discussion that begins to bring a degree of rigor to the debate over cybersecurity, right? The best way to test assertions is through looking at the actions that people are actually taking. It's not always clear. I mean, you hear a lot of people saying privacy is important to them, but I'm going to post everything I do on Facebook. There's a discontinuity there, and you can see the same discontinuities in cybersecurity and in international security. But if you were looking for a pattern, it would be that actions are pointing to a greater role for governments in this space. It's unavoidable. Actions are pointing to a larger role for the UN. It's unavoidable, right? And there's actions that point to a rebalancing of the multi-stakeholder model. What path that will take, what form that will take remains unclear. There are some individual countries that would strongly favor a very government-centric approach to the internet in the future. I think one of the things you can draw from this meeting is almost everyone thinks that would be a bad idea, right? There are others, however, who believe that we need to do some rebalancing. We need to recognize that what's become a central infrastructure for the globe can't be treated as separate from the larger context of international relations, international security, international law. And that's the path we're on. That was one of the conclusions of the panel. Cyberspace is being embedded in daily activities, in the routines we have to govern relations among states, and that will shape how we move forward in the future. The immediate task that many of our colleagues brought up was we need to find areas where cooperation is possible now, not in some distant future, not in some ideal world. That means shedding some of our preconceived notions. It means looking hard at some of the things we like to say to ourselves. But where is cooperation possible now? And it was interesting because our Korean colleagues, our Australian colleagues, Russian, American, all sort of came out in the same place. Transparency and confidence building measures are the place where we can make progress in the near future. And these will be important as a way to increase stability in cyberspace. So overall, an interesting panel. We could have probably gone on for another hour, a lot of details to go through. When I think about this, the points that struck me were major changes in the political landscape, growing areas of consensus, but still deep, deep debate over the path to take in the future to make cyberspace both secure and stable. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm glad to hear that there was some progress in UNGG's recent activities. And next is Deputy Minister François Guimond, who will speak about cybercrime.
Thank you, Kim, much appreciated. As I was listening to my colleagues summarizing their panels, I'm struck by how the headings are different. I'll be addressing cybercrime, that was my panel. but how the path forward uses similar terminology. So bear with me. I don't mean to repeat simply to repeat. It's just that there is obviously a number of convergent points. I'm also struck, before getting into the substance here, by how the last couple of days have shown to us that cyberspace, the internet, is future for the globe. There is growth, there is freedom, there is prosperity aspect to the cyberspace that we all want to benefit from. It's quite clear, and it's very stark. In French, we say, bear with me, où il y a de l'homme, il y aura de l'hommerie. So where you have humans, you will have human behavior. Now, very often, colleagues, that is a metaphor to essentially mean you're going to have good behavior and you're going to have not so great behavior. That's what being human is all about. And that was the obviously central theme of the cybercrime panel, which I was responsible for moderating, which, by the way, I would note the panel members were all outstanding, just to be matching some of what my colleagues said here today. And just to touch on this at the outset, a feeling that cybercrime, maybe differently than other crimes, is very scalable. You can have lone actors, you could have a number of people, it can be local in communities, it can be in a city, it can be national in a country, and then it can be international. Very scalable. Can morph itself very, very quickly. The sixth panelists we had, without going through their names, you have that in the program, did touch on the law enforcement at both national and international level, private sector, academia, civil society, and international institutions as well. At the outset, I would also say that their remarks were informed by the Seoul, I should say Seoul in French, so I'm always confused, so it is Seoul, I can assure you, conference process and their professional experience as well. So they drew from that. And they superimposed this reality to their work in their day-to-day lives. And they were looking at, obviously, basic strategies that can deal with cybercrime as we understand it. I posed a challenge to the panelists, which was pretty straightforward, I suppose, in some way, which is, do you have some practical solutions that you can draw in tackling cybercrime from your perspective? And it was quite clear to me, to us collectively, that the whole concept of cooperation, something you heard, dialogue, capacity building, were ingredients that were critical in tackling cybercrime. Panelists provided insight into a variety of approaches to facilitate public-private partnership. Let's not think of cybercrime as being an issue that is to be handled by governments only. There's a continuum out there, a continuum of point of intervention, a continuum implying or involving individuals, government, private sector, and to be successful in this field will need a united effort. Examples of practical measures that are being put in place by some police agencies were mentioned, measures that could serve as practical guide for any nation, such as designation of points of contact, something simple but very powerful. Panelists spoke about efforts to assist law enforcement agencies, such as establishing the Interpol Global Complex for Innovation that will have at its core the fostering of partnership for cyber innovation and operational support. A theme that was heard throughout the panel and repeated more than once was the need for global capacity building, something that we've heard in other panels as well. It was understood, it was recognized that global capacity building can have very immediate benefits. But we were reminded that capacity building is not a magic bullet, a silver bullet, in the sense that countries which benefit from capacity building initiatives may also be facing other issues related to crime activity, criminal activities. And in that sense, they can also have fiscal realities, skills, and technology shortages. All that to say that capacity building from donor countries, cooperating countries, has to be tailored to the needs of the people that are receiving the help and the support. Another point that was made on capacity building, which is worth noting, is more people knocking at the door to help with the same product may not be what is the best way to go about bridging the gap on cyber crime activities. So one has to be coordinated, one has to try to minimize overlaps in duplication as support is being provided. The theme of cooperation was nicely summarized by one speaker who said that if there is only one thing to be done, it is to cooperate at all levels. And many other speakers also describe cooperation as the only way forward. We even saw, in some way, cooperation taking place right there during the panel when the private sector speaker undertook to approach the Interpol's new center when he heard about the new opportunities for public-private partnership. Other examples of collaborations were identified by speakers, such as the establishment of the Cybercrime Program Office in Romania and the practical aspects of Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. Panelists also spoke about some of the successes against cybercrimes, cases where international collaboration effort by law enforcement agency can have a real impact on cyber criminals. Now, there are challenges. Cybercrime is pervasive, unfortunately. It's just the reality. It needs to be tackled. And some of the remaining challenges that were noted by the panelists touched on the growth in mobile computing, and that provides new platform for cyber criminals. The need for resources, writ large, financial resources, human resources, maybe some technologies, was also acknowledged as being an ongoing issue. And improvements in laws, in our laws, national laws, to address the matter of preservation orders and searches and seizure issues. Just to conclude and not to be too long, you heard me say a few words, I hope, about capacity building, cooperation, open dialogue as being cornerstones to be able to tackle cybercrime. We need better coordination. We need to be able to compare data. We can't be in a world of comparing apples and oranges, especially in cybercrime as we're trying to pursue criminals. Our resources are limited, so our actions need to be based on an assessment of risk. We can't be chasing everything at once. And national strategies will facilitate our collaboration. So good domestic national approaches can fit very nicely into international approaches dealing with cybercrime. Thank you very much. Merci.
Thank you very much. You also talked about capacity building, which will be represented by Dr. Hyun-Suk Lee, and he will, you will go to the podium, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very good afternoon. It is a great privilege for me to report to you the outcome of the deliberation made during the panel session on capacity building. I'm not sure whether I'm the youngest one here in this panelist group, but the truth is the reason I'm standing is because I'm experiencing pain on my low back. So I would like to stand and to present about the summary of our session. This occasion has given us much needed platform to examine very closely the fundamental issue of capacity building in cyberspace, particularly for cybersecurity. The capacity building issue has also been mentioned by almost all the presenters this afternoon. So I believe it signifies that the theme of this capacity building is indeed a very important topic. So in a world where ICTs have become drivers of progress and development, we find ourselves facing old and new challenges. When the benefits of ICT are unevenly distributed, the digital divide creates an opportunity divide that perpetuates the development divide. So with the increasing reliance on the internet and ICTs around the world, a cybersecurity divide also emerges. The countries, most of countries, particularly developing ones, often lack the capacities to realize the opportunities offered by cyberspace and respond effectively to cybersecurity challenges. So the issue of capacity building, which was addressed in our panel session this morning, has never been more crucial. It is very meaningful to see that capacity building is included as distinct panel for the first time in the series of the cyberspace conferences. And also, I'd like to take note that this Seoul conference also marks the first time that developing countries have been invited and are actively engaged in the dialogue. Indeed, cyberspace is a space for everyone. So we must strive to solicit the perspective of developed and developing countries alike. So the objective and discussion of our session, we try to aim to examine the current landscape on capacity building on cyberspace and cybersecurity, and identify the needs and challenges, particularly of developing countries, share current initiatives, practices, and approaches, as well as lessons learned, discuss ways to ensure multi-stakeholder collaboration and sustainability of capacity building initiatives. This is another term keep coming, the multi-stakeholder collaborative approach and partnership. So the outcome of the two pre-workshops on capacity building held in Seoul and Washington, D.C. last month was also shared during our panel. So our panel consisted of a very diverse group of representatives, including government, international organizations, private sector, and academia. Like Mr. Jo Tae-yeol, Vice Minister of the Foreign Affairs, Korean government, Ms. Hana Tete, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration, Ghana, and Ms. Samia Melham, the lead ICT policy specialist, World Bank, Ms. Lina Abdullah, Chair of APEC-TEL, and Mr. Magdi Martinez-Soliman, UNDP Deputy Assistant Administrator, and Mr. Matt Tomlinson from Microsoft, Ms. Sadi Chris, Director of Global Center for Cybersecurity Capacity Building, Oxford University, and Mr. Tim Unin, Secretary General of Commonwealth Telecommunication Organization, UK. So I'd like to summarize the discussion point along with the objective I just presented a couple of minutes ago. With more devices and the users connected, coupled with the rapidity in the development ICT, the cybersecurity landscape becomes more complex, and along with the challenge of capacity building. So managing the cyber risks will be difficult, as the sophistication of the security threats outpaces the capacities that we have and skills of the countries and the institutions, as well as the skills and knowledge of security professionals and users. So many countries lack the capacity to keep with the pace of change in cyberspace. So the core needs and priorities in capacity building for cybersecurity that have been identified in the panel include the following: developing appropriate policies and strategies, as well as legal and regulatory framework for cybersecurity, policing transactions in cyberspace, and formulating rules and regulations on how to govern and safeguard internet uses in public space, strengthening of internet governance capacity for cybersecurity, strengthening capacity to run and manage sophisticated technologies related to cyberspace. Cybersecurity today just remains in the hand of experts. So we should make cybersecurity the business, cybersecurity business and responsibility of everyone, not only the experts group. And that there is a need to increase awareness in all sectors, including government, business, citizens. Developing mechanism for timely exchange of cyber threat information among stakeholders. Updating of existing cybersecurity capabilities to respond to current threats and challenges. Of course, this does not really meant to be exhaustive list, but these are some issues mentioned during our panel. The panelists also highlighted their current practices and initiatives in the context of cybersecurity capacity building. For example, the Republic of Korea provided bilateral assistance in areas such as infrastructure development, developing legal and regulatory framework, and e-government context. And the government of Ghana passed legislation to promote ICT access, initiated a national cybersecurity policy, and established a national data center to serve as repository of records and information. It also enacted a Data Protection Act to ensure protection of private data of government, citizens, and businesses. In the World Bank, ICT has now been mainstreamed into its portfolio of development projects for connectivity, transformation, and innovation. APEC has formulated a strategy for trusted, secure, and sustainable online environment that aims to raise awareness on cybersecurity, harmonize policies, promote collaboration among stakeholders, and increase R&D efforts. UNDP also shared their e-government programs. Microsoft has initiated programs on skills training for youth, providing affordable access to ICT devices and promoting entrepreneurship. It also undertakes industry-government collaboration in the area of computer incident response, attack mitigation, and citizen outreach. Whenever we talk about capacity development or any development agenda, sustainability is a critical issue. And it is even more critical when it comes to capacity building efforts because it is long-term endeavor. Then how to ensure sustainability of capacity building? Are there any key success factors? The panel underscored that there should be mutual learning between donors and recipients of assistance. And it is necessary for governments, civil society, private sector, and other relevant actors to work together to build capacity and function effectively. In doing so, full engagement of all stakeholders in conducting assessment and finding solutions based on collaborative capacities is a must. And we must develop a mechanism to avoid duplication of efforts and reinventing the wheel. This is also mentioned by one of the other the panelists. There is no best practice. There are many good practices that can be shared and applied to different contexts. There is no one-size-fits-all. Shared practice must also be appropriate practice. So, one more point, and we need to leverage the contribution and expertise of knowledge providers, including academia, in cybersecurity capacity building. Absolutely, this should be the must. So, we had 90 minutes, like other panel. Certainly, it is very, very short time to cover every issue in capacity building, in cyberspace and cybersecurity, to discuss what the gaps are, what we need to do, and how to move forward. But I'm confident that we have touched upon many critical issues and inspired further thought for future actions. Confidence and security in the use of ICTs are among the main pillars of information society as affirmed in the WSIS Plan of Action. I'm sure that all the deliberations that we made today will be useful in finalizing the Seoul principle and guidelines for an open and secure cyberspace, and also discussions with WSIS Plus 10 upcoming next year. And on behalf of the panel, I'd like to thank the organizer of this conference for drawing attention to the importance of capacity building in cyberspace and cybersecurity. This is challenging, and a long-term effort. So everyone emphasized the partnership. And I have here Honorable Minister, Madam Tete, the minister from Ghana. The minister, I'm going to share an African proverb. That is, if we want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Am I doing right? Thank you. So, capacity building is long journey. I don't think we can go fast. And also cyberspace, cybersecurity, this is something completely connected. We got to go together. I guess this is the reason that multi-stakeholder approach keep coming and the partnership and collaboration issues are keep coming. So the coming from United Nations, APCICT, Asia Pacific Center on Information Communication Technology for Development, which is a very long name, in short, UN, APCICT. We have a mandate of building ICT human institutional capacity using ICT for development. I'd like to conclude my summary report to this plenary by sharing the underlying principles that our center operates. That is, ICT alone is a simply tool. When it works for people and people know how to use it, it transforms our hope into reality. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. My apologies. I forgot to introduce the process of this panel. And originally, I assigned 10 minutes for each panelist. And then I know that they did a good job in faithfully conveying the outcomes of their respective sessions. And then I know also that they are experts and they are excellent in each of the areas. So I want to hear some comments or their opinions from out of their expertise and experiences. So originally it was 2 minutes, but due to the time limit, it can be 1 minute. So be very brief. And this time it will be in reverse direction, starting from Dr. Lee.
Thank you. During our Q&A session, I think I'm overly excited. Thank you. And I wasn't able to report about Q&A, so let me touch a little bit on the Q&A sessions. And this particularly on the multi-stakeholder approach and the need of engaging CSO, that was mentioned. And in United Nations, CSO is recognized as development partners. And particularly, their CSO, the role of CSO is reached to community level. And therefore, I think engaging the civil society organizations into this the development agenda in general, and also cybersecurity capacity building would be important. The second point I want to say is this, there was comment on that there's no best practice, many good practices, and also mutual understanding, not one way of knowledge transfer from donor to recipient. It should be from the recipient to the donor side. And another notion came up is how to identify the right person to work with from the government. And another question was, one size does not fit all. So I thought about these questions after we finished the panel. So underlying aspect of this question is how we really bring the relevant program to our recipient. This is issue of relevancy. I think it touched all this point is related to that. So for example, when we talk about here the information security capacity building, cybersecurity capacity building issue, the donors may provide some kind of guideline or share guidelines and toolkits and with, let's suppose, and the recipient country. But the thing is, technical specification would be the same communication protocol, maybe, and the similar hardware, software. But a lot of the software component, the soft side of component, such as government system and openness of the government and the populations and the cultural aspect, this is very unique of the recipient side. And therefore, working together, so in that sense, it's a mutual understanding is very important. But the one of the lacking capacity we can find here, in general sense of capacity building, I also experienced myself in our work. A lot of international consultants, they are lacking the local capacity, local knowledge. So this is the team approach we need to do. The capacity building, we need to highlight it. And that's why one of the panelists mentioned about the delegation from Hungary, saying that technical problem does not necessarily require, all of the technical problem does not require only technical solution. That is a behavior issue, that is a cultural issue, it is a human issue. So in this regard, I think working together with the recipient side and the donor side with mutual understanding, mutual sharing of knowledge would be very important. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. François Guillemot.
Thank you, merci. Just 2 points, and I won't be too long. And it's interesting, again, I'll have to start repeating what my colleague has just said. On capacity building, I was chatting with our folks back in Canada, and we're quite involved in Canada with the OAS, and I was very interested in understanding how priorities were set to support countries. And my question was, do we have also a list of what their expectations are? And do we have a good match between the two? So it's not a one-way street. So I'm very much of the view, again, that having that good match, non-replicative between countries is very important. Second point on that topic, I don't always look at capacity building as something that necessarily needs to be like very expensive. Capacity building can be on governance issues. Some resources may be deployed in some other cases on having a response center that may be a bit more onerous. But I don't necessarily associate capacity building with necessarily big resources to achieve big outcomes. In this field, good resources, well deployed against priorities as set by a country can make a big difference. Second point briefly, on crime, cybercrime, crime in general, most of you comes from various walks of life, and certainly a number of you have had experiences with law enforcement in general. I'm always surprised at myself looking at criminal activities, in this case cybercrime, where at the end of the day, criminal activities are all slightly ahead of where we are. That's why we don't catch them ahead of time. We catch them after. I make emphasis on that point to simply state that it is therefore very important to be able to dissect and understand cybercrime. And it's as important, to be able to share information, share experiences. What will happen in a given country on cybercrime may be different in part in another country, but there will be elements that are replicable. And the sooner you get ahead of the curve, the more effective one can be at dealing with cybercrime.
Thanks so much. You know, we have 4 questions up here. I don't think that you can see them, so I won't read them. 3 of them are good. I won't tell you which 3. You know, one of the things that's interesting to me, and it came out of this conference, is there is sort of a consensus on what an agenda for a cybersecurity conference should look like. And so you see discussions of capacity building and cybercrime and international security and all the other issues. And so it's interesting that these topics are seen as politically necessary to make progress in this area. If I was going to comment on some of the questions, I think we could probably benefit from finding ways to sharpen the discussion, maybe be a little more precise. Always a good thing. This is such a new field. It's been interesting to see the range of participants here. One of the key points that we keep coming back to is this multi-stakeholder, right? And I wish I had $1 for every time someone said multi-stakeholder. But one of the things that has come up is, why do we talk about multi-stakeholder? Because the internet, although it was created by government, right, was driven at an incredible pace by the private sector, and it's been governed by the private sector. And that model has brought tremendous benefit, right? The idea, I was one of the people who worked on the initial commercialization of the internet. We had no idea it would grow to be this big. We thought, you know, a couple 100 million users, it'll be like eBay or Amazon. It's changed our lives. And so thinking about how you incorporate the successes of the multi-stakeholder model, how do you get the multi-stakeholder model involved in issues that it didn't used to talk about? It didn't used to talk about capacity building. It didn't talk about cybercrime. It didn't talk about international security. How do you broaden our discussion? How do you involve the private sector in meaningful ways? And to say a group of government experts one more time, one of the things that was novel in that was the call for the private sector to play a role in thinking about norms, confidence building, how we move forward. And I think that will be one of the issues that we're going to wrestle with for a while. Why are we doing this? I mean, one of the questions up here is, you know, why are we all here, right? We're here because the internet has become the central infrastructure of the global economy. It's become a central force in politics, and it's become a deep, deep concern for nations on their national security, right? So there's political forces, military forces, economic forces that have been unleashed by this technology. I don't think that they change as rapidly as you hear some people say, it changes so fast. It doesn't actually change that fast, right? I mean, to use an example, IPv6, the next version of the internet protocol, 1992, right? That's more than 20 years ago. That doesn't strike me as overwhelmingly rapid change. What is changing rapidly is our perception of the problem, our understanding of the problem, right? And the depth of our knowledge. So as we learn more and as we have meetings like this, I think you'll see the chance to involve more people in the range of issues we've covered here and to maybe start scoping out areas for progress. I'm not as confident as I was. A few years ago, I was much more optimistic. And, you know, in some ways, again, as we did when we were commercializing the darn thing, we probably underestimate the scope of the effect. We probably underestimate the breadth of how the internet affects our lives, right? And because of that, as we appreciate what the political, military, economic effects are, we will have to work through new ways of cooperating, right? And that's where meetings like this have been very useful.
Okay, thank you. I was about to warn you. Thank you. Yeah, Dr. Lu.
A couple of quick observations from my own point of view, and then something that really surprised me about the panel. On the whole question of security and cybersecurity, security is typically something that societies assign to their governments to handle. We want safe streets. Governments, you run the police. You make the laws. We want a safe country. Governments, you run the military. So governments are used to being the big players in security space, and they are in all space except cyberspace. And in fact, what we're seeing now is an emerging sense that, you know, we need to have this conversation, not just as individual national societies, but as a global society as well. And the question when we ask is, well, to whom should we give responsibility for our security in cyberspace? Well, typically you give it to the most powerful. Well, when we think about who are the most powerful actors in cyberspace, you run out of fingers before you get to a government. They're all companies. The most powerful actors in cyberspace right now are the Yahoos, the Facebooks, the Googles, Apples, the others. You know them as well as I do. So we're confronting a reality equipped with habits of doing business together that are really not well suited to that reality. Cybersecurity really consists in two simple propositions: that your information and your identity can be safe and secure while you're online. It's currently not the case. And this is what surprised me about the panel. The technologists among us have known for a very long time that 4 measures will reduce our vulnerability by an overwhelming amount. 4 measures that we can take now as an organization or an enterprise, and there's a version of them for us as individual users, why aren't we being told, at a minimum, to take those 4 steps, the top 4 of the critical controls, top 4 or 5, the Australians have a list, a number of people have a list, but the top 4 or 5 are the same. And what surprised me was when I asked, why aren't governments telling us this? The answer was, there's really no good reason. So, you know, one hopes that this conference will be a first statement in giving the public very practical advice of things they should start doing right now to protect themselves in cyberspace, beginning with the top 4 critical controls. Thank you.
Next, Ambassador.
Thank you. 3 remarks from my panel. One is that we should not underestimate the immense importance of the distribution of knowledge through the education on online education. What is now happening with massive open online education, and with the way that governments and private institutions now starts to invest on education techniques, is a distribution of knowledge globally to every corner of the world where there is an interested person who wants to educate himself or herself. This distribution of knowledge is a part of a process of modernization which goes all over the world. And the second dimension of this modernization is, of course, the social interaction through various social media and in the professional work or wherever. This modernization takes place in the same time, more or less everywhere. And of course, some societies are will be more stressed than others of this modernization, because they are in a different stage of development. But there is, through the internet, a spread of knowledge and a spread of ideas and a spread of values that will mean profound changes of societies. It will not necessarily be a less diverse societies, but they will be different. The second remark I would like to make is that there is a world out there of open source resources. And this world of open source resources is an enormous library for experimental work. This open source world, it's a word that is open for those who have programming skills and now know how to manage software. This is a knowledge that must be there for everyone. I am a strong advocate of looking upon programming capacity as a language that everyone actually should be taught in school. Everyone should learn in school. Because if you don't have this capacity, this fantastic resource, this fantastic environment, which is open source, where you can dwell with it yourself and deal with it, and evaluate, and you can experiment, and you can take part in a entrepreneurial activity, which is it's of a character that we have never seen before in the world. We should remember that the software as such is not more than 60, 70 years old, actually. But if we get the young generation on a very broad level to understand how to program and how to develop software, it will be an increased human intellectual capacity in a way that is mind-boggling.
Well, I thought this was a fascinating mini discussion, if you like, as each panelist summed up, each moderator summed up their panel. If I had to pick out one that was particularly thought-provoking, was Jim's summary of his panel, where he talked about the consensus between China, Russia, and the US. But this was a linguistic consensus rather than a policy consensus, and his thoughts about where things might go, because just as Jim gets $1 for every time somebody mentions the multi-stakeholder approach, I get $1 for every time somebody says how the internet is central to economic growth. So we're both billionaires in that sense. But the two are intrinsically related, and this is why this discussion is so fundamental, and why these panels relate to each other. We all know that the internet is driving economic growth all around the world, and it's really, only just started, because only about less than a third of the world is online at the moment. I happen to believe that one of the reasons for that is because of the way the internet is governed by this multi-stakeholder approach, this openness, this coming together of government, civic society, and business. And then Jane, of course, talks about the cybersecurity and how we can no longer work in silos, and all these elements are coming together, and we have to address them together if we are going to continue to see this extraordinary innovation and revolution that the internet has brought to us. What are the answers then? Well, I think, first of all, we absolutely have to advocate the multi-stakeholder model. I think it is a very dangerous path to go down a model where government controls and dictates, as it were, what happens on the internet, what people have referred to as the balkanization or fragmentation of the internet. I think we risk throwing away a lot of this innovation. But then I think something that Jane said struck a chord with me as a policymaker and politician in the UK, which is that I work with business because I recognize that business, to a certain extent, unlike other fields, has this, is almost in charge of the internet in that sense. And I work on what I regard as public policy issues, the protection of children online, for example, piracy, the theft of intellectual property, privacy, people's right to have, as it were, personal security on the internet, let alone the global cybersecurity issues between nations. And I think one lesson that business perhaps should take in this discussion, too often business say to me, well, we won't do anything unless you pass a law to make us do that. And that is precisely the wrong answer, because the more you encourage government to legislate in this area, the more you will get a regulated and atrophied internet. So business does have to understand its responsibilities. And there's an odd paradox here. Just as government, I think, has to step back and act instinctively differently by not regulating and stepping in as it does in so many other fields, so business has to step up and understand that it is a partner with government. It is not going to have things done to it by government. It is going to work with governments on the very real public policy issues that politicians representing their communities have to address.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the wonderful presentations. Now is the time for questions and comments. I'd like to get some questions from the floor, but before going to that, we have SNS questions. Some of them we have to deal with. So I will read the burning 2 questions, and then you raise your hand if it's different from that question. So first one is, all panels said multi-stakeholderism. How to best achieve this multi-stakeholder model in a situation everyone has different stake? And second question is, could you elaborate on metrics between all the 6 agenda, relationship between one and another? I think that's a very hard one. And maybe this question will arrange our answers, and then raise your hand other than these questions. Okay, then we'll start from the multi-stakeholderism. Anyone can address? Maybe.
I want to hear from the audience. I'm going to pick on someone.
Okay.
If we don't see a hand up in the next 10 seconds, I'm going to ask the Polish minister to make a contribution. Excellent. This is the Polish minister.
A victim.
Give that man a microphone. Oh, he's coming to the podium. He's a natural politician. He's going to come and speak from the podium.
I'm sorry.
Okay, please.
Thank you, Ed. I would like to thank for all these discussions because I think it was very inspiring. And I would like to add something that the only possibility for creation future of free internet is to give the area for multi-stakeholders, ideas, multi-stakeholders, management and multi-stakeholders discussions. In Poland, after ACTA, we started our strong cooperation with academia, with civic organizations, with representatives of business and also administration. And in every moment in which some new hot points will start, for example, discussion on pornography network, we are started our common discussion and try to find the solution, and we want to achieve a consensus. But it needs time, it needs patience, and it needs the willing that the internet also creates new possibilities for democracy, participatory, real participatory democracy. So I think that all these suggestions and recommendations will go us to this kind of thinking about internet. Thank you, Ed, for giving me the field, and thank you for everybody for your contribution to the conference. Thank you.
Excellent.
Yeah. And thank you. Thank you, Excellency. Thank you. And thank you Ed, also for helping me. And then what about
I'm going to pick on somebody else
okay,
in a minute.
Yes.
Unless somebody wants to put their hand up. Is the Afghan minister here? The minister from Afghanistan?
Fled.
I thought I saw him in the audience. Not there.
What?
Jane, I think you should pick on someone. Each moderator should pick on someone from the audience.
Well, we've got bunches out there. Heli, is that you there at 2 o'clock for my position? Then we've got Jan and Angela from Microsoft there at 1 o'clock for my position.
Oh, let's have Microsoft to talk about the role of business
okay.
in
You guys are on the stick.
stepping up to the plate and sharing the burden with government. Christopher, we're coming to you next.
Yes, you in the blue.
Yep.
Yeah, no, really you. Stand up.
Where is
Go.
she?
This is good practice for when you go to Brussels.
Great, thanks, Jim. Now everybody knows.
Oh, that's not Microsoft, is it?
No, that's fine. Jan Neutz with Microsoft. First of all, thank you to everyone on the panel. It's been just a real interesting discussion, I think, over the last 2 days. I'd maybe ask one question, in particular to Jim and also to Jane. One of the things that has struck us in these discussions about cybersecurity norms has been that most of the discussion, as we've observed it, has really focused on, and we've heard a lot about this during the descriptions of what the GGE has focused on, the what we would call sort of law of armed conflict discussions and how the law of armed conflict applies to cyberspace. Now, from our perspective, what we see a lot in our day-to-day and how we defend our customers and things that we're concerned about really actually is a huge area of activity that is below the threshold of the law of armed conflict, which I would sort of call the gray area below LOAC. So if you could share your thoughts on how we could start broadening the discussion about norms of responsible state behavior, looking at that type of activity that is not raised to the level of what's generally described as cyber warfare. That would be interesting. And actually also your thoughts on how we could actively participate in that and be constructive. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Then what about the questions?
Is it cheating if we ask Chris Painter to answer that?
Huh? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I want Chris to make a contribution. Come on.
Stand up, Chris.
I mean, I think the answer to that last question is yes. We are dealing with these larger, higher threshold issues in the GGE, but even in the GGE, we said we should look at levels below the very high thresholds when we're talking about armed conflict, and that includes some precepts of international law around countermeasures, et cetera, but also, quite frankly, it includes thinking about other kind of peacetime norms, and that's something that we've been looking at within the U.S. I think other governments are looking at it, and that's something that we've started talking to other governments about. But when you get even below that level, then we really get into the cybercrime issues, the cybersecurity issues that were talked about by Jane and others, and what you can do both to do better defenses, but also have consequences from law enforcement, et cetera, for those kinds of activities and those kinds of actors. So, yes, I think it's true that we need that higher level framework for the very high threshold issues to build some understanding of what would happen in those issues, but we have to also look below. And when we talk about these confidence building measures that Jim mentioned, that makes everyone safer, and those do involve not just governments but the private sector to an extent, because it builds better transparency and confidence throughout the world community.
I just might make a comment. I know it's attractive, and there's a great deal of curiosity about this upper end of cyber threats, sort of the most sophisticated, the most powerful nation-state actors or whatever they might be doing. But it has, I think, led to an enormous amount of confusion when it comes to cybersecurity. So we all act as if there's some special widget. We're all searching for the next magic widget that will keep our machine safe. We're all looking for the next secret formula of if only you knew what I knew, then you would be safe. And the fact of the matter is that there are some very common sense things that most of us should do that would protect us against most of the things we confront every day. And so while I know that's a separate subject of great interest, great complexity, an enormous benefit for us to get it right after all, there is also sort of that 80% of the problem that would go away if only we would do basic hygiene.
The other part is, of course, the Budapest Convention, which is a perfectly fine convention that says everything you could want on cybercrime. If every country in the world adopted the Budapest Convention, that would get almost rid of the rest of the problem. For me, the most powerful actors in cyberspace are 3 national agencies. I won't tell you which ones. Not all American, by the way. But if we could narrow the range of actors by getting basic hygiene measures, by getting the Budapest Convention, by getting some other things, this would be a much different conversation, right? And that's kind of the path we're on. It's interesting to think you might want to go back and ask, what are the obstacles to agreement on the Budapest Convention? Why is this such a problem?
Okay, they say that it's time to close. So at this finale conference, and there's an integration of the general discussions, this session has demonstrated cyberspace we want, bringing out extensive experiences and the political leaderships of panelists. It was a wonderful opportunity for all participants to share the key deliverables of Seoul conference. Again, it was a great honor for me to be here to preside with these excellent speakers together in this final session. I'd like to express my sincere thanks to our panelists on the stage and all others who contributed to the richness of this conference, and to yourselves, audience, for your active participation. Thank you very much. This will close the plenary for. Thank you.
Thank you, Standing Commissioner Kim, all speakers and discussants. This marks the end of plenary session. Before we begin the closing ceremony today, we will have a coffee break for 20 minutes. Coffee is ready to be served in the lobby. After the coffee break, please return to your seats by 17:25. Thank you very much.